Hello, Charlene. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you, Richard? Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here and agreeing to come on. And I'm really happy that you're here. And I was kind of thinking back, you and I met kind of serendipitously at the health conference this year in October, when I think we both happened to be in the same booth at the same time and
I
just
know, that
and
was
just started
amazing.
chatting. Yeah, that's kind of the fun things about those conferences, right? When you can make these connections. And I think we bonded over the fact that my mom is a nurse, and of course you are a nurse, and that was pretty exciting. And once I learned about what you were doing with your company, I was like, oh, we got to make this happen. So thanks for taking the time to do this once again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It was really cool to meet you at Health and to see the work that you're doing as well. So very honored to be here.
Oh, thank you, thank you. You've had a pretty exciting career up until this point, Charlene. As a nurse innovator, the work that you have done with your company, Fifth Window, that you've co-founded and you are the CEO of. I'm kind of curious. You probably get this question a lot, kind of around your own personal journey into healthcare. Becoming a clinician is a huge commitment. I'm a little curious as to where that kind of, manifested for you, or what was the genesis of you wanting to go into nursing?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's interesting because I actually do come from a family of nurses.
Oh, very cool.
Um, yeah, so similar to what you were sharing about your family, my mother is a nurse.
Awesome.
I have a twin sister who is a nurse as well,
Oh, so
and
cool.
yeah, several cousins and aunts, uncles who are in the nursing profession or healthcare profession.
Mm.
And so that was my introduction.
Hmm.
I actually have known the hospital setting throughout my whole life just because of that. So, visiting my mom in the hospital when she was working, I would actually be in the hospital a lot of the time, and I was very comfortable in the environment. So, the hospital setting never made me afraid or anything. And I
That's
think
great.
that, yeah, and by the time I was in college, it made a lot of sense to be a nurse, to volunteer in hospitals. And I really enjoyed the work that I could do there. And just to see the impact that I was able to have on patient care was a big influence in my decision to stay in nursing.
Hmm. Hmm. And you and I both know from our experience in the healthcare industry, nursing is, I like to call it sort of the backbone of of what happens in terms of patient care, not only in the acute care setting, but even into the post-acute care setting, even into the ambulatory setting, right? When I was in graduate school working on my MPH, we did a lot of studies as it pertained to sort of bedside nursing, the stress and the pressure that is under bedside nurses, put upon bedside nurses, I guess I would say, in the acute care setting, the use of aides and other, licensed practitioners to try to help balance that. It's been a rough road, right, for nurses for a long time, hasn't it?
Yeah, I would
Yeah.
say being in nursing or in the healthcare profession, it does have a lot of unique challenges that
Mm.
you might not face if you're in different industries because it has several tolls. It could have a
Yeah.
lot of emotional tolls, it could have physical toll and mental toll, as we
Mm.
saw with a lot of what was happening with the pandemic.
Right.
And even before then, because I've been a nurse now, I've been a nurse for over 10 years now, which is really crazy to think about. I got my license in 2012 and I've been working as a nursing assistant before that even. But
Sure.
the whole time that I've been in this career, and it's the only career I've ever been in, right? So
Hmm.
I know for a fact how challenging it could be. So
Yeah.
I think all of those different aspects, and then adding on to it the uncertainty of things that can happen, just like the pandemic, that could be on
Hmm.
a larger global scale. It really lends to the challenges in the profession, and
Hmm.
I think that nursing has had a lot of challenges too in terms of how the public perceives nursing, what they believe their roles to be. So I think there's a number of compounding conflicts and challenges that have come up in nursing and in healthcare, and it does make it a unique profession to be in for sure.
Yeah, and there's always been this talk, right, Charlene, about nurses need to be allowed to practice at the top of their license, right? They need to do the things that they've been trained to do. I also sit on the board of the Solomont School of Nursing at the University of Massachusetts, so I get to interact with the nursing faculty and get to talk with them. And we talk about concepts like TikTok nursing and things that aren't like, true demonstrations of what it really means. and the demands that nurses face today. And like you mentioned, the pandemic exacerbated so much of that. And burnout and mental health in nursing is very real, isn't it?
It is. It's always been real. A challenge and an issue for decades before the pandemic
Mhm.
happened. I think that with the pandemic happening, it actually brought to light more about the role of nurses and what they can do and what they're capable of, the
Right.
expertise that they have. So in many ways, the pandemic was a silver lining in that respect, that it brought more
Sure.
visibility to nurses and the profession.
Sure.
But you're absolutely right that it did bring upon also more of the realities of the mental health challenges of the profession, and how that could be brought up upon these unknowns, like these force majeures, right? Like the
Right.
pandemic. And we as nurses have to be the ones to adapt to that and have
Mhm.
to respond to that, which is a really big call to action.
Yeah.
So I do believe that the mental health toll has been very real, but before the pandemic, we almost weren't allowed to talk about it.
Mm.
So during the pandemic, it became a non-negotiable to talk about it, just because there was so much happening, right?
Yes, it was happening constantly. Yeah. Yeah.
Constantly and on all levels, right? Whether you're practicing at the bedside and seeing patients face to face, versus whether, where you're an executive and in more of a leadership position, it had impacted everyone on all levels. So definitely a non-negotiable to talk about it at that standpoint.
And Charlene, was it sort of those non-negotiables that led to the sort of genesis of Fifth Window? And I would love for you to just talk for a couple of minutes about Fifth Window, sort of its mission, the work that you are doing to sort of impact the emotional well-being of nurses today.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, the non negotiable for me was more about my own personal mental health journey,
Mm.
because I'm just one of many examples of how
Sure.
nurses were impacted with their mental health on a more significant scale. So early on in the pandemic, I was facing very severe panic attacks that,
Mm.
went from monthly to weekly to almost daily. And it was
Daily, sure.
impacting my,
Especially as
yeah.
as infection rates climbed and death rates climbed, and absolutely, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And while I was not practicing clinically at the bedside at the time, I did
Hmm.
face a lot of that, vicarious or secondary trauma related to seeing what was happening and
Sure.
related to seeing how that impacted everyone that I know. Because all of my social circle is nursing.
Right.
Everyone I know is a nurse. All my friends are like many of them are
Your sister's
nurses.
a nurse. Your mom's a nurse. Yeah.
Right. My best friend's a nurse.
Yeah.
It's definitely a big part of my life. So seeing
Yeah.
things that were happening and seeing how it was impacting everyone is definitely a traumatic experience. And
Mm.
so it did well, that was a big contributing factor to the panic attacks, but it was
Hmm.
also, I actually didn't realize that I had anxiety until that happened, but I
Right.
have had anxiety for a long time.
But
So a
it
lot of
didn't
things were brought to
manifest, or
light.
you either
Yeah.
suppressed it or it didn't manifest, and it finally manifested during that period.
Right. So there
Yeah.
was a lot of things that finally came to light during the pandemic, which was, in some ways, I'm very grateful that it happened, because I don't know how I would have addressed it otherwise.
Mm.
So it was a big challenge. And I think that the reality was that many nurses were burnt out before the pandemic. And then
Right.
after it, there were so many reports about how many nurses were burnt out or how many were experiencing mental health challenges. And the scale of that, just depending on whatever survey or report that you see, it would be, sometimes it could be on like the 20% end, but then there's other surveys that go all the way to 80%
Sure.
burnout, or, so it's very real, and
Hmm.
it's still living and breathing. And I think that many people perceive the pandemic to be over, right? That the toll has run its course. But the
Right.
reality is we're still facing that
It's
toll
a very
now.
lasting effect, isn't there? Yeah. Yep.
Right. So this was really a genesis to Fifth Window, and actually in 2020, that was when the Nurse Hack for Health started, the COVID-19 virtual nurse hackathon,
Right.
and this was a collaboration between Sanciel, which is a nursing innovation organization,
Hmm.
and Johnson and Johnson.
Hmm.
And at the time, I was a Johnson and Johnson Nurse Innovation Fellow, so that was
Right.
how I found out about the hackathon, and it was one of the first virtual hackathons that I have ever participated in. And I think that we're ever even available to the healthcare profession to join. And so in that hackathon, that was how I was able to team up with other nurses and also technical team members to create our idea, which eventually led to what Fifth Window is. And so that was a really big win, and we were able to see the potential in what this idea could do. So that
Right.
was really the origin story of how it all began. So really happy that that happened.
I mentioned that I in taking the time to do a little research on you, I did look at your article and read your article on, from Johnson and Johnson, watched your videos on things. And, one of the things that struck me was the concept that you had about vulnerability and permission to be vulnerable. And look, nurses are a tough bunch, right? And they have to be tough. And I think people expect them to be tough, right? And not maybe show that there's a break in the armor or what have you. And you really explored, I think, why vulnerability is so key to the well-being of a nurse and maybe just of people in general, but we're going to talk about nurses. And really,
Hmm.
I was curious as to how Fifth Window integrates into this concept. Would you explore that a little bit with us right now around vulnerability, Charlene?
Yeah, absolutely. And the concept of vulnerability is so important in nursing because, just like we talked about a little bit earlier, the culture of medicine does not always enable this vulnerability or does
Right.
not always expect people in the profession to be vulnerable with each other. You
Mm,
might see that more in terms of our interactions with patients, and we allow the space for patients to be vulnerable. But
sure.
the space for providers, clinicians, leaders to be vulnerable is almost, it's not really existent. It wasn't
Mm,
not really an expectation, or it was not part of our training, not part of our studies. And so I think many of us who are in the field today came into the profession without the know-how or without the permission to really feel like they
right.
could be
So they could be
vulnerable.
vulnerable. Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. And that was a space that we explored with Fifth Window because we wanted to be that space, really
Hmm.
fill that gap in terms of no being a space for the clinicians to explore wellness and to
Yep.
connect with others on the topic of wellness.
Hmm.
We held live stream conversations with nurses and talked about a lot of things that might have been considered taboo several years ago.
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
yeah, just topics about mental health and well-being,
Right.
topics about things like suicide prevention, things like
Mm,
therapy, and
mm,
and I think that all of these topics are things that I've never seen it like years ago even. So
right.
it was definitely a new kind of frontier for us, and I think it's a much needed space.
In terms of the space and the safe space that you are creating for nurses to connect on Fifth Window, how does Fifth Window do that? You mentioned the live streams, but just what's the mechanism, I guess, Charlene, that takes place?
Yeah, actually in 2022 we launched the first version of our app, which we did build an app on it was available on, Apple and Google Play Store, and it was a combination of practices that we created as
Hmm.
nurses for nurses. So it was meditation, self-care
I
practices.
love this. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that was the first iteration, and then as we continued on, we found, the monthly spotlights or live streams that we had were actually ways that we could interact with our community in real time. And
Hmm.
we actually found that there was more engagement on those live streams than there were in the app itself. And I could see why, because it's hard to do self-care practices on your own, right? But
Right.
when you connect to a community and you see other people and you talk about it and you could connect with them on that level that's not always available in your unit or in your department or with your team, it fills that gap, and it becomes that space where you could talk more freely, or at least have more of this authenticity, or more
Mm,
of this ability to be yourself and to not have to put this armor on, right, that you might have to
yeah.
do when you're in your workplace. So
Sure.
that's what we wanted to provide. And we're actually in the process of we actually are in the process of updating our app, so we're almost done with releasing a new version of our app, which is it's actually fully focused on the community space. So we're
Oh,
really
that's
excited
exciting.
to,
Yeah, that's
yeah,
very
we're really
exciting.
excited to lean into that.
And in terms of the, I don't want to assume anything, Charlene, right? But when you think about sort of the core values behind the Fifth Window platform and the solution itself, where does that kind of, or where did that come from, and how would you articulate those?
Yeah, absolutely. So with our rebrand, we actually have four pillars that we're focusing on. And so the four pillars that we're focusing on are creativity, growth, health, and spirit. So these
Mm,
are four different branches that make up different ways that you could actually cultivate your joy in nursing. So our new tagline is Nurse Your Joy. Formerly, our
I love that.
tagline was, yeah, because formerly our tagline was Nurse Your Mind, because we were focusing on mental health and wellness
Right.
primarily. But then we realized that, mental health and wellness is just one component
Hmm.
of finding that joy and cultivating that joy with others in nursing, and to really continue that passion to stay in nursing, right? And to continue your work in nursing in
Mm.
a way that is sustainable, and in a way that's more productive, I would say. So those are the four pillars that we have. And with our new tagline of Nurse Your Joy, we really wanted to lean into that concept so that we could
Yeah.
do this all together, because
Mhm.
all those four pillars are things that we haven't been able to really lean into in the
Sure.
workplace or in
Certainly
school, or
in the
yeah.
last couple of years, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Hmm.
Absolutely. And in terms of, Charlene, of the sort of like feature function, platform features, platform benefits, and accessibility, what are the things you're kind of most excited about? You mentioned community, in the community space is one. Are there others?
Yeah, so we are going to start primarily with virtual events that we're going to do in each of those four pillars.
Hmm.
Eventually, we want to also branch into in-person events. We did have
Nice.
our first retreat last year in November, and it was a great realization how beneficial these types of activities can be for people. We had the nurses who participated say things like, "This is life-changing. I feel like a whole new person."
Right.
So we really see the benefits in terms of how these different activities, which are really focused on, creativity, growth, health, and spirit, how
Mm.
that could really make you cultivate this joy, right? So
Yeah.
so those are the two main things. Eventually, we would want to offer continuing education credits so that you could
Nice.
also,
Yep.
in addition to the learning and the participating, you could also actively gain credits that you could use for your license or whatever it might be, or just for your additional learning.
That makes sense.
And
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And so this is on our app, which will be available first on the App Store. So that's what we're aiming for first, and then continuing on from there with the feedback from our community. So this is our starting point, but we're really excited about it.
That's wonderful. And you really, I mean, I know it's your starting point, but you've already been doing so much already. Like you mentioned virtual events, what you did in November. Anything that has come back from that, feedback you've received, or anything that really either kind of surprised you or stood out to you, Charlene?
Well, some feedback that really surprised me was actually during health, because when we were at
Mhm.
health, we had our fifth window booth there as
Right.
part of the nurse approved cohort. And that was a great experience because we were able to talk to nurses that came up to our booth, and also non-healthcare professionals or non-nurses who came up to our booth. And what we found actually was that a lot of people have connections to these four pillars, but they never talk about it.
Yeah.
So I am also a tarot reader. so
Oh, very
I
cool.
Yeah, so for example, so that's one of the things that I tie to my spirituality and my
Hmm.
spiritual journey. And I talked about that a lot at the health conference. And I was actually really surprised to find that many of the people I talked to also do tarot reading.
Oh,
Like, I
wow.
literally never have
Yeah.
talked about that in the workplace because it's not really something you talk about.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and it is something that will definitely get a response from people, right?
Right,
Yeah.
right. It could be you're not really quite sure what the response will be when you bring
Right.
something up like that, because we don't really have that space, right, to
Mm.
talk about
Right.
spirituality in that sense. And everyone has different spiritual journeys, but that was my experience. And so being able to hear people say that at health, that they had the similar, that they use tarot cards or other things to help with their spiritual practices,
Yeah.
that actually really made me think. It was like a light bulb, like, oh my gosh, I think that there is a potential here because we're more connected than we think.
I love that. It's kind of reminiscent and reminds me of a conversation that I had a long time ago with someone who was having severe sort of osteopathic pain, right? And
Right,
they were moving to acupuncture as a way
right,
to deal with this their bone pain. And of course, there's some people look at acupuncture as, oh, it doesn't work, and this person said to me the most compelling thing, which was like, hey, I don't know about any of this, but all I know is I feel better when I'm doing it. So like,
right.
right?
Hmm.
Like, so then that's great. So you should do it, right? If it makes you feel better when you're doing it, then you should do it, right? Yeah.
Right. It's
Yeah.
it's the I like to compare it to the concept of how we explore spiritual care for our patients in the hospital, right?
Hmm.
When we have patients who request spiritual care services in the hospital, we don't question how they like to practice their spirituality.
Right.
We respond to what their wishes are, and a lot of that might look like prayer, or it might look like having a
Meditation.
chaplain come
Yeah.
in, right, or meditation.
Hmm.
And so those are unique practices that are specific to the individual,
Mm.
and there's, of course, everyone also has their own individual practices for that as a clinician.
Yeah.
And so that's something that we really wanted to tap into, in addition to, of course, looking at things like creativity and growth and still fostering our health. But it was a realization to, to see how we could lean into even more of that vulnerability aspect, right?
Mm.
Because a lot of this comes into play with the realization that there is still opportunity to be more vulnerable as staff, as leaders, as clinicians that work together, so that we can have these dialogues and conversations more openly. And I
I
think
love
that
that.
will make a
Yeah.
big difference.
Absolutely. I'd love to switch gears a little bit, Charlene, and I'd love to talk to you about Charlene the entrepreneur. Because look, I mean, you're taking on this challenge of building a company, of building a solution, a platform. Um, that's a lot of work, right? I mean, that's a
It's a
lot
bit
of
of work.
work.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as an entrepreneur, as someone who's co-founding a company in in the healthcare space, especially in the space where you're trying to bring so many different components together, right? How has your sort of entrepreneurial journey been here, Charlene? But maybe even before you get into that, did you ever envision yourself as someone who was going to embark on an entrepreneurial journey?
I would say at the start of my nursing career, no, I never anticipated that. And
Mm,
part of that is because when I was in nursing school, we didn't have the conversations about innovation and entrepreneurship. Those were
right.
also similar to mental health. That was also another thing that was just never discussed
Never
in
talked
school
about.
or
Yeah.
trained, right?
Yep.
Or residency, never talked about, because innovation was just not associated with nursing at the time.
Hmm.
It at that time, it was more of, I thought of it more in the lens of quality improvement,
Right.
performance improvement. And I knew for a fact, stemming from school, that I was very interested in improvement, because I was
Hmm.
always wanting to be part of efforts to make improvements
Yeah.
in the clubs that I was in, like the healthcare clubs I was in school. I was actually one of the first nurses in this medical volunteering club within the alma mater that I was at.
Oh, very
And
cool.
yeah, and it was just things like that. They were kind of like little pieces, or like kind of little pieces of information that made a lot of sense looking back later. And when I was in my first inpatient nursing job, I that was where my process improvement really, it became much more apparent that I was really interested in innovation.
Mm.
And it was entrepreneurship at the time, right? Because it was within
Yeah.
the it
Yeah.
was
That's
within
yeah.
the healthcare system,
Yep.
and I was a
Absolutely.
huge fan of that. I was always volunteering for committees, like, shared leadership, and trying to be in all those different things. And then when I saw, Rebecca Love's TED Talk about nurse-led
Oh,
innovation,
yeah. 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 Yeah.
that really connected and resonated
Yeah.
with
Hit you,
me.
huh? Yeah.
Yeah, and that led me to applying to the Johnson & Johnson Nurse Innovation Fellowship, which then led to me being in the hackathons, which then led me to really pursuing entrepreneurship as a potential, like a real thing that I could do. So it
And
was all these little steps.
well,
Yeah.
and that's pretty remarkable, Charlene, right? Because you kind of kept going through all like you say, you go from, oh, I was doing work in my academic career, clubs, joining TQM committees or whatever else you were CQI, and then sort of like, oh, there's this thing called the Nurse Innovator Fellowship. Okay, let me check out that. Oh, now there's this thing that's a hackathon. Let me check that out. Oh, okay, now I'm actually going to plant a flag and start a company.
Yeah. Yeah, why not?
Yeah, why not? Well, but why not somebody, you could have left it up to somebody else to go and figure out, right? But you didn't.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
very true. I
Yeah.
actually, when I was an inpatient nurse at the bedside, I remember talking to my nursing colleagues, and they would tell me about real challenges that they were facing at the bedside, and they
Mm.
had solutions for it. And I would ask them, "Have you brought this to your manager or to leadership?" And they would say, "No, why would I? Like, nothing is going to change."
Right.
And that really stuck with me because I was thinking to myself, you're actually the best person to bring about
Mm-hmm.
the change. You know this better than anyone.
Mm.
You're capable.
Mm-hmm.
It just let me realize how what the mindset was of nursing at the
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
because nurses didn't perceive themselves to be that, the one who could bring that solution or change, even if they had the idea. So I really just took that to heart, and I just thought to myself, actually, like, we are the ones who can make the change, and I
Right.
saw that with the different things that I was able to do when I was at the bedside. So I think it was just something that made a lot of sense to me. But as far as where that came from, I don't always know where that came from. I'm not sure, actually. I think I've always been curious. I've always been a curious person, so I've always liked to experiment with things. I always like to try new things, and that just manifested that way, and being part of these different projects, committees, and trying to find solutions, and eventually leading to leadership, and then also entrepreneurship. So
I love that.
it's a
Yeah.
very interesting path it's been.
Well, and the very little that I know about you, what I am hearing you say is that notion of curiosity, and more importantly, I think, Charlene, that notion of openness. It seems like you're just open to, right? Like there's got to be other opportunities here. There's got to be other ways to do this. There's got to be ways that we can sort of embrace creativity. I hear a lot of openness in what you say.
Yeah, I believe so. I've always felt that I was open to different ways of doing things
Mm,
and different ways of exploring things. Before nursing, I actually wanted to be an engineer, or
mm.
I actually wanted to
So
be,
still problem solving.
yeah,
That's what, yeah, yeah,
right. And
yeah.
I see that connection now because I think I really enjoy problem solving and just
Mhm.
being kind of a person that can help to solve challenges, no matter how small or complex. It's just been an interest of mine, and just seeing what you could do, and what your actions can do and how it can impact people has been a great motivation. And I think that each individual and each individual nurse has so much that they can offer and so much
Yeah.
potential.
I think there's such an interesting intersection and interrelationship between, individual, well, problem solvers, but problem solvers who are clinical problem solvers who are technical problem solvers. Because to me, what you're always doing is trying to understand how new variables and new information affects the current state. So as a nurse, you may say, well, if we increase their medication, they're going to have this potential. We want to see what will happen if we do that, right? We're going to introduce this new variable of an increase in medication, or we're going to introduce this new variable in a change in medication. On the engineering side, you're introducing new variables like, oh, we're going to see what happens if we increase the amount of users on the platform, or if we, try this other approach to how we're handling the loading of data. So it's a constant like experimentation, and all those variables come in, and you have to deal with those variables, and you have to find solves for those variables. And in sometimes, as nurses, I don't need to tell you this, not just one variable at a time, but multiple variables are coming in at a time, hitting you, right? And you have to react to them in
Right.
real time, right? That's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many different factors that you
Yeah.
could address at any given time in nursing, whether you're, seeing patients or whether you're leading nurses. So definitely a lot to juggle, and that's also why there's so much potential for innovation, because there's so many opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. As Fifth Window is kind of building this community for nurses, right? Where's your community, Charlene, around entrepreneurship? You mentioned, everybody you know is a nurse, mom, sister, best friend. Where's your community of entrepreneurship sort of where's the food for that coming from for you?
Yeah, I would say that a lot of that stemmed from the cohort that I was with during the Nurse Innovation Fellowship. I
Hmm.
was one of 12 nurses in the cohort, so we all still connect in different ways. I saw actually several of them at the health conference
Oh, that's
too.
cool. Yep.
Yeah, so several of us were in the nurse approved cohort, and then I still connect. There's a huge community of nurse innovators, entrepreneurs on LinkedIn, so that's how I find out about a lot of them. That's how I connect with a lot of them. I'm also part of several different groups like Sanciel, the Commission for Nurse Reimbursement, and then I also just find communities outside of that. Just I always invest in coaching and mentorship, and
Nice.
and learning from other people who have insights that I can, that I can learn from and benefit from. So I just always find myself just gravitating towards different groups with these interests and just these different ways to improve or look at things differently.
I love it. And it's important, right? Just as it's important for your nurses to find community and safeness and safety, I should say, and vulnerability. As an entrepreneur, you need to do the same, right? You need to be able to find a cohort of folks that are living the same kind of life that you're living, that you can exchange ideas with, you can cry to, you can have joys to, you can lean on, right? It's so important because this is hard work that you're doing, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I would say too, I'm very fortunate to have co-founders in my team because
Mm,
I know people who are also solopreneurs, and I know that's a very different journey.
very different
Uh,
journey. Yep.
exactly, because there's three of us in Fifth Window right now, and me and my co-founder Kathy, we were actually both nurses from that original hackathon team from 2020. So we've been on this journey together for several years, and we've
Awesome.
only yeah, and we've only met to each other in person 2 times,
Wow.
which
Wow.
is kind of crazy to think about, right? That we were
Right.
able to
Well,
for
this
so long work
it's
together.
the virtuality that we live in today, right? It's pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah, it's awesome. It opens so many doors for communities, and we hope that Fifth Window is another avenue for that for nurses to be able to find their community. So
That's
that's
great.
also one of our goals.
You mentioned, I think about as we sit here at the start of a new year, and you sort of mentioned some of the upcoming things that you're excited about as it pertains to Fifth Window. If you look even further down the line, Charlene, obviously without getting too specific, are there really exciting milestones that you folks are hoping to achieve, either in the long term or even in the longer term?
Yeah, I would say the ultimate goal would be for Fifth Window to serve as a social support network for global healthcare professionals. So
Mm.
really expanding to healthcare professionals
Beyond
worldwide because
nursing, yep.
yeah,
Mhm.
beyond nursing, so
Beyond the
expanding
U.S.
to
Yep.
yeah, and beyond the US. So
Mhm.
because we saw this great need, and actually when we were early in the stages of building Fifth Window, we had visitors to our website from over 55 different countries. And so I think that really speaks to the incredible need for these spaces and these communities and resources all across the globe. So
Mm.
I think that there's a real potential there because I would say the culture of medicine is probably not that different all around the world. so so I think that there's definitely
We're all
opportunities
facing a
for
lot of the same challenges for
vulnerabilities.
sure.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
More room for authenticity, vulnerability, and growth in these different ways.
Charlene, you've been so open and generous with us. I'm curious as we kind of wrap things up with you, what you sort of live by in terms of maybe your personal mantra, your professional mantra. Are they one and the same? How would you describe that?
Yeah, I think that for the longest time, my personal and professional mantra has been centered on that theme of curiosity
Mm.
and just continuing to ask questions. I'm someone who likes to ask a lot of different questions, and so it's really led me to different places and different paths and opportunities. And I think that it's, you know, if there's a path in front of you that you're passionate about and you have an idea about, and that even if that path looks muddy, why not try to take one step and see where it goes and see where it
Right.
takes you?
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. Well, I want to say thank you to the work that you and Fifth Window and your co-founder and your team are doing around, just helping nurses who are feeling overwhelmed and burned out know that they can prioritize their well-being while still continuing to be great nurses and still continuing to make a difference, right? So thank you and your team
Right.
for doing that.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's been a pleasure to be here to share a little bit about my story and about Fifth Window. So thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome. We have been speaking to Charlene Platon from Fifth Window. For more information about Fifth Window, they can head over to fifthwindow.com. Thank you, Charlene.
Thank you.